Hello, everyone. This is Meg Ryan, and thank you for coming to my presentation. This was a year-long action research project that I completed at the Mount Hood Community College Head Start program, and it is called Early Learning as Equity: Exploring Intentional Inclusion in Head Start. So this project looked at inclusion in Head Start, and the reason that I am so interested in inclusion in Head Start is because when I started out as a Head Start classroom teacher years ago, I was not aware of the term inclusion or what that specifically meant as far as integrating children with disabilities and their typically developing peers. And then I began studying inclusion in grad school, and I realized, oh, I do that. But the term was not widely used in my program or in our curriculum or in our work with parents. And that is pretty interesting to me, especially when I learned about the enrollment requirements of Head Start that make it an inherently inclusive program. So, taking on a role supporting teachers and classroom teams as an education specialist has especially emphasized to me the opportunity that Head Start teachers have to facilitate inclusion. And it's also made clear to me the barriers and the potentials teachers face in engaging inclusive education. So, the purpose of this study is to examine how Head Start teachers facilitate intentional inclusive education. And my research question guiding me through was, how do Head Start teachers practice intentional inclusive education? Something that you'll probably hear me mention again is that the Head Start performance standards only mention inclusion as far as those enrollment requirements, and there's no further guidance on how inclusion is specifically facilitated in Head Start programs. So, my hope with this study is to look at how teachers are intentionally facilitating inclusion so that we can use that information to inform resources and policies and procedures to further support intentional inclusion in Head Start programming. Um, and the systemic study of inclusive teaching practices can shine greater light on how educators are enacting the Head Start mission of addressing inequality through education. So, to start my research project, I started with a literature review and I looked at both Head Start and also inclusion. Head Start has worked to address social and economic inequality through education since it started in 1965 as a small 8-week summer program inspired by President Johnson's War on Poverty. It was designed by the Office of Economic Opportunity with a mission to help break the cycle of poverty by providing a comprehensive program to low-income children and their families, and it included education, social, health, nutritional, and psychological services. And this history is very important in understanding the legacy and outcomes of Head Start programming since then. For decades, there have been numerous studies showing the comprehensive outcomes for children and for families of Head Start. Program participation has shown early cognitive gains, social, emotional health developments that last through young adulthood. Head Start has been shown to address long term income related development gaps. And many researchers argue that Head Start's greatest strength is this program wide focus on providing comprehensive services to the entire family. The literature also shows how Head Start has historically expanded to meet community need and serve those most marginalized by society. And expansions have been targeted towards families experiencing homelessness, children of migrant farm workers, residents of federally recognized American Indian reservations, and Alaska Native villages. And the most contemporary statute reauthorizing the program included a number of performance standards to support children with disabilities, which included the requirement that at least 10% of enrollment for Head Start be reserved for children qualifying for services under the Individuals Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. This law mandates a free and appropriate public education for all children with a documented disability. So, a major effort of Head Start programming has been mainstreaming children with disabilities. and continues to be a priority today. So, continuing on to inclusion, as with Head Start participation, the benefits of inclusive early childhood education have been shown to be comprehensive and reach beyond typical academic gains. Inclusive preschool programs for children with and without disabilities have shown children to be more accepting of those with disabilities, treating these children like equal members of their classroom society. And studies indicate that typically developing children can show positive development, social, and emotional outcomes from inclusive experiences, as well as their peers with disabilities. And studies have also shown lots of positive outcomes for participating families. The inclusion literature also tells us that there is a big need for intention in facilitating inclusive education, and inclusion implies more than just placing young children in the classroom with typically developing peers. Contact among children with different abilities is by itself not enough to create an anti-bias and therefore truly inclusive classroom. Teachers and programs must use intentional strategies to create quality inclusive classrooms. Though many of these strategies for intentional inclusion abound in the literature, Head Start performance standards do not consist of any specific policy and procedure for facilitating this intentional inclusion. So while securing enrollment for children with disabilities is an important step forward, Head Start programs will need to implement specific inclusion policies in order to facilitate inclusive programming. And so this study was to look at how teachers and programs are facilitating intentional inclusion to get a better idea of how we can create policy and procedure and programming for more intentional, impactful inclusion overall. So I conducted semi-structured interviews about inclusion philosophy and experience with 4 lead teachers, 2 early childhood special education service providers from MECP, the Multnomah Early Childhood Program, 2 family workers, and 1 manager, the education manager. So, through my interviews, I got a lot of information and so much raw data. Staff shared so many different definitions and philosophies of inclusion, and a lot of very specific strategies for implementing intentional inclusion in their classrooms through curriculum and instruction, daily routines, classroom procedures, and through their work with families. And everyone told me a lot about how their role specifically supports inclusion in our program. So, what I did in my report is I separated all of this data into 2 main themes: the strengths of our program, and then the areas of growth identified by staff. What I heard most from both teachers and other program staff was how much of a value of inclusion they have, both personally in their practice and also as a program. It was especially interesting talking to the MECP providers as they work with different Head Start programs and their colleagues work with different Head Start programs. And they said a lot about how MHCC really works to not only enroll children with disabilities, but to keep them enrolled and set up structures so that their families feel welcome and included and stay with the program. And this value of inclusion was echoed by teachers in the work that they do and how they work with both students and families. I also heard a lot about family engagement and what a big part of the inclusive practice of every staff it is. Every teacher highlighted working with families and different strategies for them doing so, and every other person I interviewed also talked a lot about family engagement, both in their role themselves and as a program overall. And then collaboration came up so much, both for teachers and the way that they work with their MECP team and other service providers, also how they collaborate with families. Overall, a really big takeaway for me was how every teacher and the staff that they work with described inclusion not as a set of specific strategies, but as a process that takes a lot of observation and collaboration. And I included this quote from a teacher that I think encompasses what I heard across the board. Inclusion is so much more than being invited to a table or to not be excluded from something. Inclusion is an ongoing process. Inclusion is webbed in every detail of the curriculum, embedded throughout the day, and supported by staff and peers alike. Inclusion is ensuring that we strive to meet the needs of all we serve. So, building on the strengths I heard from teachers and program staff about inclusion in our program, I also heard some themes in areas for growth. Collaboration is something that was identified over and over as a strength of our program. It's also something that all staff interviewed said they would like to see more of. So, more collaboration and embedded collaboration between MECP teams and teachers. There was also a really interesting conversation with MECP about more collaboration between themselves and mental health services, because so often the caseload of mental health referrals and children receiving special education services overlaps. Um, there and also about collaboration between other program areas, and especially how inclusion could be incorporated into mental health or family services. Staff asked for more teacher training and support in serving all the needs of their classrooms. And overall, there was a sense of that a shared vision would be really helpful for a specific definition and philosophy of inclusion for the program, so that inclusion strategies could fall back on that shared vision and definition and a mission of inclusion at MHCC Head Start. So, in my discussion and conclusion, I identified two major themes presented by the data in both strengths and area to grow. And through an analysis of these themes supported by the literature and implications for further research, I identified specific recommendations in the work for intentional inclusion, both at my own Head Start program and for Head Start policy nationwide. The first of these themes is collaboration, and this is something that was mentioned as a strength of the program over and over, and is also an area for growth because teachers and program staff love all the collaboration that they do have, and they would like to see more of it. And program staff would especially like to see more collaboration between service areas. Teacher education and experience also mostly came from experience in the field and working with colleagues and families. And that's where most of the training and professional development in inclusion came from. So, through embedded collaboration processes, we could create systems to encourage and support this. Staff also identified themes of teacher burnout and low morale. Head Start is notoriously hard on teachers, and there are high rates of burnout and teacher turnover across the nation. And studies have shown that collaboration among teachers boosts overall morale, and collaboration among staff and stakeholders is also a key ingredient for comprehensive trauma-informed approaches in education. And a pressing issue in Head Start is the high rate of trauma exposure reported by children and families. So ultimately, the literature shows that classroom collaboration is essential for the growth, success, and inclusion of all children in the classroom. And this is especially true for children receiving special education services. So an expansion and embedding of collaboration in the program can help teachers, service providers, and families strengthen relationships and build towards more desired outcomes for children and families, and ultimately create a more inclusive program. The other big theme here is consistency, because in order to embrace the support for intentional inclusion, consistency is needed. The literature reiterated that intentional inclusion means more than simply being present. And while there always will be some variation depending on teachers and classrooms, inclusion standards in curriculum and instruction would raise the bar overall. Inclusion is a value in this program. However, I noticed how educators and program specialists all reported varying definitions and philosophies of inclusion, and this often leads to varying degrees of implementation and widely different strategies. So a big part of consistency would be a defined inclusion mission and inclusion component. The literature on quality inclusive early childhood programs calls for any program to have a philosophy and mission for inclusive practices, as well as well-defined values and expectations supporting inclusion. And this work also calls for a consistent system of family involvement, staff development, and teacher collaboration. I think a lot of that is a part of MHCC Head Start, and what could make it even better would be a consistent embedded inclusion component in all of that. And the literature on inclusion also shows that programs that embrace consistent collaborative practices are set up to provide high quality inclusive education, and embedding this into program policy and procedure is an important step in this work. So making an inclusion part of all areas of the program. And part of this would mean sharing resources and strategies about inclusion for and with all staff in all program areas. So that was a lot of theory. And in the final section of my report, I hope you're all with me, I give specific recommendations for intentional inclusion. The first being that to adopt consistent and collaborative practices, Head Start programs should create a mission statement for inclusion with well-defined core values and expectations. As I said, right now, Head Start performance standards outline enrollment requirements, and that's it. And they can start by creating a performance standard around programs having a mission statement of inclusion, and integrating this across content areas and throughout the program. So this would give definitions of inclusion and tasks of each program area. So how does family services facilitate intentional inclusion? How do education specialists coach on inclusion, etc.? Programs can also embed collaboration between classrooms, families, and content areas. So for instance, combining inclusion into the education program area and combining special education and mental health services, creating specific home visits to include different content areas and inclusion, and also creating systems for teachers to share strategies and ideas with each other, such as a sway about specific inclusion strategies. So this study was very illuminating of the inclusion practices at MHCC Head Start. It also illuminated a lot of areas for future research, such as the differences between Head Start programs, even between different Head Start programs in the Portland metro area, and other perspectives of inclusion, such as the experiences of children and family participants in inclusive environments. So ultimately, a lot of different research could provide additional information on inclusion strategies within the national program standards and how that might influence programming overall. So ultimately, the Head Start enrollment policies on special education services can be looked to as a jumping off point for further action. And through comprehensive and collaborative efforts, Head Start programs can facilitate and promote intentional inclusion to better serve children and families, continuing the Head Start legacy of supporting communities and using education as a vehicle for equity. So thank you all so much for attending my presentation. Here are some selected references that really informed this research and also this presentation and are a great jumping off point to digging into inclusion in Head Start. Again, thank you, and don't forget to fill out your feedback form.